I read your introduction to the report, and this time round, as a result of the pandemic, we see health risks as being the #1 risk flagged by those that were surveyed. I got the impression from the introduction, think that that may be the wrong way of looking at things. How would you sequence the risks that we now face, and how would you order them differently to most of the respondents?
Yes, so thank you, Guy. We've done this risk report now for the 7th time and have a very good view how the positioning of risks have evolved. What we've seen is that climate risk has been for a very long time the top risk, and due to the tragic and unfortunate context of COVID-19, the health risk has certainly taken the first place. Personally, I do believe that in the long run, the climate risk should remain the #1 risk, because it is the anchor risk of many other risks we see, be it on the health side, be it on the question around social tension, but also be it on the question around geopolitical issues that we live every day. So personally, for me, I do believe that the climate risk still merits the #1 risk position.
I wonder, though, what we learned from the pandemic in terms of vulnerabilities on a geopolitical level, as well as a healthcare system level and poverty level, that then also translate into the risks that climate change will bring.
No, it's absolutely true, Alex, because the issue is that those risks cannot be seen in silos anymore. They are today very much interlinked, and we have seen exactly this in the pandemic. If you look, the pandemic has shocked health systems, has certainly shocked countries that didn't have the means to provide a social cushion, and have certainly also fueled geopolitical tensions because of the interconnectivity of our world today. So all of these risks are more complex, more interlinked, and it makes it also more difficult to say, how can we find solutions in order to protect us against them?
Thomas, let's talk about how the industry has coped during this period of accelerated change. There have been concerns that the industry has not delivered for some of its customers in the way that they anticipated. COVID has accelerated many of the trends. Do you think that the insurance industry is doing a good job now in serving its customers, and how does it need to change as a result of what we've learned during COVID?
So we were in a situation, Guy, in which we are now faced with very new risks that we haven't seen in the past, and risks that we also have never insured in the past. And it is therefore absolutely to be expected that you come into a situation where you certainly have to, the industry has certainly paid for what it was covering. When there were ambiguous situations, because you can't always foresee everything, certainly AXA has made a very big effort in making sure that we solve those ambiguous situations to the benefit of our customer. And then obviously you have a residual risk, because here we are talking about a systemic risk. It is not a classical health risk where 1 out of 10 people get sick. Here, everybody is potentially sick and everybody is being hit. Whole countries were basically put to stop, which is called a systemic risk. It's a new risk, and we need to find new ways of public and private partnership in solving for those risk questions that have never been on the table. And this is also the reason why we've been very early on in the process proposing a new regime to cover those risks, which is very much a public and private partnership between the states and the private actors to make sure that we are better insured and protected going forward.
So what does that mean? Does that mean that the governments wind up having to split the risks with insurers? What does that mean?
So we find ourselves in this case in a very particular situation. We have far more risk now, risks that are new that we don't know. And at the same time, we have a population that has become more risk averse. And so with those two combined, we need to make sure that we find a solution in which we cover for the systemic risk. And if you take, for example, the proposal that is currently on the table in France, the so-called CATEX regime, is basically to say, look, we are going to find a solution where private actors and the state come in together, build a new insurance scheme for these kind of things that needs to be, generated in terms of their funds for a couple of years. But in those regimes, it is clear that the states and the governments will have to provide the majority of the funding for such systemic crisis.
All right, so let's talk about one of the other macroeconomic changes that we've seen as a result of COVID, a significant increase in government balance sheets. Debt has gone up and gone up substantially. As a result, central banks have been forced to cut interest rates aggressively and probably will have to leave them there for a very, very long time. What does that mean in terms of the insurance industry? You are huge portfolio managers. You are now faced with a situation where you are having to raise the risk within the portfolio to generate a return. I'm wondering if the insurance industry is comfortable with that, and I reference back to your previous answer in terms of socializing risk. And does it mean as well that the cost of insurance, the premiums paid, are likely to have to rise as well because portfolios within insurers are not generating the returns that they once did?
So yeah, it is very clear that this unfortunate situation has led to even lower interest rates. We were already in a phase before the crisis of low interest rates. Now it's lower for longer, which means that we need to, one, think about our product propositions. How can we really still create and offer attractive solutions for retirement in a low interest rate environment? Because the desire of people, certainly in a more aging society, for better retirement solutions has not dropped. So that's the one thing we need to do. Secondly, we need to see how we reprice our products, because the investment income is certainly one part of the entire way of making sure that we can cover claims and the risks, and therefore if there is less of it, it will mean that we need to increase prices. However, I would look at the question around low interest rates more at a macro level and more again at a societal level, because what does it mean? Low interest rates or interest rates at zero are essentially a tax to the saving population that will have difficulty to make sure that the retirement is sufficient. And with the demography that we have, we will probably run again into a social topic around retirement savings and retirement funding.
The other part of that is the market for green bonds that's particularly getting developed in Europe. What's your demand for that, and how do you think that market's going to develop and feed into the thesis you were just talking about?
So I think it's a fantastic way to use a crisis to push transition. And I was very glad to see that the European Recovery Program is basing the financing on 30% of green bonds, because I do believe leveraging the rebuilding to be more sustainable is great. There is, and we've started this journey very early by going out of, for example, coal investments and going into green bonds. There is today a very established market, a very strong market. What we need to make sure going forward is that this market is very well defined and that there is no danger of what I would call a greenwashing, that when we buy green, we know exactly that it is green and that will also remain green. But I'm very positive and very much looking forward to being a big participant in that market.
How does that work then? Let's talk about, say, 10-year bond. Do we need to see very careful language being written into the prospectus that basically says, for example, in the last 2 years of the bond, if the green criteria have not been met, the interest rate rises and rises significantly? How easy is it going to be able for the industry to ensure that there are deliverables and they are delivered upon?
So I think there's two things. One is the question of how do you, as I said earlier, define very well what is green and what is not green. Today, I do believe we have already a sufficient amount of regulation and policy around it. There is the taxonomy on the European level, which is about to be finalized. There is the TCFD, so the Task Force for Financial Disclosure, around stranded assets and sustainable assets. So you have, I think, a very well-developed policy framework that needs to now be more enforced, and so that more companies are using it, that more companies are forced to really present their transition strategy when it comes to the energy transition. And then there's a second part, which is more, I would say, on the financial engineering and the financial innovation around those bonds, where you link those bonds then to very concrete outcomes on sustainability, like you mentioned earlier. But you need those two.